It's the week ending Friday the 17th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Israel and Hamas agreeing to a ceasefire, Rachel Reeves pledging to go further and faster to boost economic growth, and the successful launch of a reusable rocket from Cape Canaveral. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's the boss man, Holden Frith, plus we welcome back journalist and podcaster Julia McFarlane and writer and performer Sir Chandrika Chakrabarti. Holden, we've previously discussed that you're a qualified pilot. If you were a billionaire with your own reusable rocket, where would you fly to?
I guess it has to be Mars, really, doesn't it? That's the next place to go.
How's your life insurance, Holden?
I love the fact that he's already discounting the moon.
Well, we've already been to the moon.
We've done the moon.
Find somewhere new.
Got the gist. Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why misinformation is driving women to come off the pill and away from conventional medicine.
Here's part 2 on things I wish I would have known in the beginning of my fertility awareness journey that would have made a ton of a difference when it comes to this topic. In the beginning, my cycle chart, my temperature pattern was all over the place. High and low valleys. It was really hard for me to identify when ovulation has passed in order to confirm that I was in the infertile time of my cycle.
A video posted by Jasmine Caviezel to Instagram on Tuesday. She calls herself a fertility cycle educator. Julia, what's the story?
So this is really interesting. There was some new figures that came out this week showing that between 2018 and 2023, abortions in England and Wales reached record levels. They were up by a quarter, more than 250,000 abortions in total. Now, there's, of course, a lot of reasons why a woman may choose to terminate a pregnancy, but there has been a noted trend observed over the same time period, according to the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and that is that a growing number of women are turning away from hormonal contraception, like the implant or the contraceptive pill, and they're increasingly relying on so-called natural birth control. You know, that in itself is nothing new. People have been doing family planning for a long time. But what's happening is these social media apps which track your fertility have been advising women when their so-called infertile days are. They've been heavily promoted by social media influencers like the lady you just heard. And according to the BMJ study, use of these apps has risen almost sixfold among those terminating pregnancies in the same time period. Also, users are becoming younger.
Okay, but we don't know that there's a correlation, do we? We can't prove the link between people using fertility apps and a rise in abortions.
Absolutely. There is association and correlation, but not necessarily causation. But one thing you do see in these apps is they do market the idea that you have a so-called fertile window. It's about 5 days out of the month. And they do advise, I mean, I use one of these apps. It's useful to know when I may or may not be on my period. Planning my wedding was particularly useful to know that I would not be on the blob during my wedding.
Wow.
So there's a number of reasons why people use these things. But they do say the chances of pregnancy are very low or very high on these days. And so, you know, one can assume that a lot of women think that they might be safe to have unprotected sex. The chance of pregnancy is low, but actually low but not zero, as we seem to see from the data.
And Sir Chandrika, do you think that assumption is something that is part of the package of these apps as they're promoted? Because obviously as a man, I've never used one personally and I've not been on the receiving end of that promotion. I'd always assumed that a fertility app actually would be about telling you when you're fertile so that you can get pregnant. So you're thinking, right, I want this window and that's more likely to achieve conception. The idea to me that women were using it to say, I'm unlikely to get pregnant, so let's go at it with no barrier method, no nothing, seems like a complete step away from what I assumed the function was.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it's not women saying that, is it? It's in a heterosexual relationship, it's their male partner going, woohoo! Let's go at it with no barrier, no nothing. So I think it's a combination of pleasing the person they're in a relationship with and also feeling safe to then not have barriers involved, because like hormonal contraception is so problematic in so many ways. So many women have huge problems with it. You have to try hormonal contraception for 3 months. In those 3 months, it can ruin your life, and people get depression to quite a terrifying level, all sorts of terrible things. So hormones are powerful. People have started on hormonal contraception at sort of 16 sometimes. I don't know if a 16-year-old can really understand the level to which this pill can change their emotions. Anything hormonal is very tricky, and what women find they have to do is then cycle through different brands. 3 months. That's a year easily gone of having a really terrible time, severe depression, physical symptoms.
Right, so basically, if you allow me to summarise, I think what you're saying is it's not the solution, but it's sometimes just accepted as a simple solution, because it's like, oh, finally, no chemicals.
And there's also an added effect of not having to go very quote-unquote back to condoms in a relationship, which the male partner will be happy with as well, generally.
Holden, is this a trend just in the UK, or are we seeing this happen in other countries as well?
No, it does seem to be broader than that. It is quite difficult to get comparable statistics in this sort of area, but if you're looking at sort of general trends rather than precise numbers, it does seem pretty certain that across Europe, North America, other industrialized countries, you are seeing a reduction in the use of the pill. Parts of the world where it's going in the opposite direction are the areas where the use was much lower to start with. So across Africa, you're actually seeing a substantial rise in use of contraceptive pill. Kenya is a really interesting case study where it looks as if you can trust the numbers, it looks as if Kenya actually has a higher rate of use of the contraceptive pill than the UK does now. I think there are sort of some doubts about precisely the levels, but you're looking at a country that has gone from almost no use of contraception to very widespread use, whereas it looks as if the places where adoption of the pill has been very high are now starting to go into reverse and seeing quite substantial declines. The pandemic seems to have been a tipping point in a lot of places. You saw declining use beforehand, but then a sudden acceleration around 2020, 2021.
So with all of this on board then, Julia, I mean, as a user of these kinds of apps, is this good news or bad news for those apps? Should people be more cautious about using them but still use them, or do you think they just need to come with many, many more health warnings or be banned, or what?
I think it depends on the app. It depends on the reason why you're using it. The one that I use certainly comes with a lot of caveats. When it comes up with information about my cycle, how I might be feeling on this day, it comes up with, this is not a replacement for seeking medical help. This is not a guarantee that you will or will not get pregnant in this time. What I think is so interesting about this, and why I wanted to talk about this week, is it is part of a growing pattern of not just women, but of people shunning conventional medicine in wider aspects of our life. Now, the NHS has recently warned that misinformation about the hormonal contraception methods is putting people off the pill. There are myths that the pill causes infertility. There are myths that it causes long-term health effects. There are all kinds of problems with the contraceptive pill. That is absolutely true, but there is also a lot of misinformation about it. And to look at this trend wider, particularly when it comes to female and maternal health, another trend which is also growing is this idea that women, or the sort of the paragon of giving birth, and the ideal way of giving birth is to give birth at home unassisted. It's called free birthing. A lot of people, a lot of social media influencers, all kinds of really big social media influencers have recently espoused how they gave birth at home in a water tub. They didn't have an epidural. And that's one way to give birth, but this is alarming a lot of health professionals, because people who are choosing to turn away from going to hospitals, turning away from midwives, turning away from having epidurals, all these kinds of things, fetal monitoring, there is risks for people giving birth at home without any medical assistance in case there are risks of things that they don't know about. And so there's a lot of concern that is growing amid this trend. There was a woman who gave birth in the ocean, a wellness influencer who posted about how she gave birth in the sea. And so many doctors in the comments on this Instagram video were saying, please don't do this. The sea is not clean. This is very dangerous for your kids. This is not something to promote.
I've lost footballs in the sea.
Yeah, you don't want to do it. And you don't know, particularly in this country, there's all kinds of sewage and stuff. So that's absolutely, don't give birth in the sea. But there is a growing backlash to how birth has been, quote, over-medicalised, some people say.
Which I suppose, Suchandrika, is quite useful in terms of reframing how people think about, the established medical options that they'll be presented with and what they might want to say when they have a consultation with a midwife. But the point is, it's all ammunition for that conversation, isn't it? And the end of the conversation might well be, well, I'd like to have what feels like a more natural birth, but I'd like to do it in a medical setting in case something goes wrong, or I'd like to have someone there who has access to drugs. And I suppose in the binary world of the internet, it's kind of like, for social media points, no, I'm going to go and do it in the sea. I mean, that's the problem.
Historically speaking, a natural birth doesn't really bode well for the mother. It's actually not what you want. Like, centuries of medical knowledge and practice and horrible trial and error have gone into trying to make birth safer. It's not safe for everyone. Like, every body is different, everyone has different levels of hormones, different skeleton, different everything, and the outcomes are so completely different for everyone that to make it a binary of medicalised and unmedicalised is to simplify it to a really dangerous extent. There is something I read in The Guardian. It was an opinion piece about a woman sort of looking at, can you manifest the perfect birth? And the answer is no, not really.
I could have guessed that the answer was no.
Manifesting, right? But she did say maybe there's something around the increasing sort of level of C-sections that are being used. So maternal age is going up, and often what goes hand in hand with that very generally is the C-section levels. So a woman over 35 is much more likely to have a C-section, and once you have one cesarean, you tend to be advised to have cesareans for your births after that. So if you have one, you tend to end up, if you have 3 children, having 3 cesareans. And so people are definitely kind of having a backlash towards that, because a C-section feels very invasive. It has after effects where you can't pick up your child for 6 weeks and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, you can't really choose what level of medical complication your birth might be. And I will give this piece of advice from a very good friend who's an obs and gynae consultant, just had a second child. She said the ideal, the dream, is to be in a hospital to try and have a vaginal birth, but to be the closest bed to a theatre just in case. And actually, with her first birth, that's what happened. It ended up being an emergency C-section.
Yeah, same, in fact, with my wife's first birth. But Holden, when it comes to getting medical information from professionals to counterbalance what we're seeing on social media, there are issues around lack of access in this country. It might be just as easy to point the finger at that rather than to say, oh, social media is the problem, apps are the problem. Well, they're filling a hole that, the medical establishment is failing to reach.
Yeah, I think you could say that it's too hard to get information from official sources, and it's too easy to get information from unofficial sources, or at least to get information that it can be very hard to know how much weight you should set by it. There has been a long-term decline in the provision of sexual health clinics and information. Even getting a GP appointment, we know, has got much harder in recent years. And I think, one of the reasons why there probably was a big downturn in all sorts of contraception use, actually, but particularly the pill and the coil during the pandemic, was a time where people didn't want to go to GPs if they could possibly help it. And then, after that, your ability to get a GP appointment was often very constrained in different places. And once you've kind of broken that link in that cycle, then a group of people are never going to come back. They're going to kind of find their own way. But also others will, you will look for information in other places. And if there is a general sort of sense of you're hearing the same message from lots of different places about, potential side effects, yourself from your experience that there are side effects for a lot of people from hormonal birth control, that means you are going to put a bit more weight to perhaps exaggerated ideas about, potential risks that may be being overstated. There's often this sort of sense that there's either misinformation or there's correct information, and those two things are clearly distinct from each other. But I think actually this is an area where there's a really broad spectrum, and because everybody's experience of it will be slightly different, it can be quite hard to disentangle those two strands.
And when it comes to these social media influencers, Julia, do you think they need to take more responsibility personally as individuals to do the kind of rigorous counterbalancing that you'd get on public service television, where, you know, a doctor would be there in the studio to say, well, this is what we think in the NHS, after you've heard from the natural birth advocate? Or do you think actually, you know, the users are a bit more sophisticated these days? They understand where someone's coming from. It's more authentic if they speak their truth and then they seek alternatives themselves.
Listen, I think this is all very profitable. There is a growing sort of sphere of like wellness influencers. And for them, the way they give birth in an ideal world matches their brand. There's one wellness influencer who I follow, who I generally like her stuff, Deliciously Ella. I'm sure we all know, we're all aware of her. She has good plant recipes and she has a very like pro sort of clean eating, healthy, natural ethos. And she has spoken a lot about the fact that she gave birth at home in a tub, didn't have an epidural, didn't tear, which is another reason why women are sort of trying to advocate not having an epidural, because there is correlation with tearing when you have an epidural. And so I think people like Deliciously Ella, they do feed this idea that there is something to aspire to, and for them that's part of their business, it's part of their brand, it's part of their marketing. I wouldn't necessarily say that she specifically is being irresponsible with that, but from one end of the scale you get people like Deliciously Ella, you get other influencers like the lady giving birth in the ocean.
But sort of what you're saying though is no, they shouldn't take responsibility because there's a financial imperative for them not to, but that's not good enough.
No, I think it's
ethically,
unrealistic for them to. They're not medical professionals and they're not really giving medical advice. What they are selling is a lifestyle, and they're using themselves as the advertising tool. So they're saying, this is how I live, this is my beautiful farmhouse and the sheep that I get eggs from and the cows that I milk and all this kind of stuff.
No one eats sheep eggs, do they?
Sorry, the chicken whose eggs that I get, and the cows who I milk and all that kind of stuff.
new health trend there.
Yeah. And so I think it's unrealistic to expect that they will put that additional sort of context, because for them it's all about this sort of image that they're trying to put forward.
I mean, to return to the very sort of simple but important point you were making, Suchandrika, there is a solution to all of this, which is men need to wear condoms more. I mean, I do wonder where are the male influencers saying that?
Yeah, there's this thing of like it's a woman's problem, isn't it? But as Julia's saying, this has shifted into lifestyle, whereas giving birth is very rarely like that plan comes through. Like, Ollie, you know about this, and having more honesty about the surprises along the way. I mentioned earlier about people starting on contraceptive pill at 16. Often they do that because they might have a condition like PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, other things which affect their periods, and they don't get a period every month. Now that is masked when they're on this pill for possibly 20 years. It's pretty normal now. At 36, maybe think, might have a child. When they come off that pill, their periods go back to that sort of patient zero situation where they're irregular again. It can also, the condition can lead to like difficulties with pregnancy. Now that's actually the conversation we need to be having, especially if someone can't get a GP appointment. We need to find other ways to get that information to them and actually talk about their specific condition, because it manifests differently in everyone. And it's kind of, do you aspire to be part of the ballerina farmhouse thing? Like that's misleading people and leading to dangerous situations. So I don't think the influencers themselves are going to self-regulate, but we might need to look at regulating any medical advice that is given out on social platforms, however that can happen.
Okay, we are going to skip from gynecology to dentistry next, after this. Okay, Holden, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why we all take our diets on the chin.
And about 1 in 8 people are addicted to them. So their brain lights up when they get these foods, and that's because they have brilliant chemists working for these companies, because they pay them 3 times more than they would get in universities, and they work out the exact amount of sugar, fat, and salt you need to tickle the brain, and they're doing brain scans to work out exactly
get out of here
how much that combination is that, again, you didn't find in nature.
Professor Tim Spector on Jamie Lang's podcast Great Company last week. Holden, what's the story this week?
Yeah, the claim this week is that our changing diet, and particularly the rise of ultra-processed foods, is not only making us less healthy, more likely to be obese and more prone to a whole range of illnesses, but also actually changing the shape of our skulls. Research published by the Catholic University of Valencia in Spain concluded that children who eat more ultra-processed food end up having smaller jaws, and they're even more likely to end up with buck teeth because there's just not enough room for them to grow into.
Explain how that works. I mean, why would you get buck teeth because you're eating soft food?
Yeah, the theory is that these soft foods, if children eat them, the study looked at children between the age of 3 and 5, so when people are growing a lot.
So this is like eating, French fries rather than carrots, basically, right? So
yeah,
softer.
in essence, yeah. So once people have been weaned, they're eating solid foods, but instead of crunchy, crispy foods, they're almost continuing to eat baby food, essentially. Mm-hmm. Although it's not marketed as such, but that means that their teeth, their jaws are subject to less hard work, less pressure, and that has an effect on bone density, muscle mass, the shape of those bones and muscles, and it just means that because the jaw isn't being used as much, it doesn't grow as much, and that then means there isn't space for adult teeth to grow into. When you're trying to force these larger teeth into a smaller area, they end up having to kind of stick out to find space.
Okay, and that matters. Why? Because I think some people listening to this will be thinking, well, our bodies evolve anyway based on technology, circumstance. We've got central heating that will probably affect our bodies in 100 years' time. Does it matter if our bodies change to adapt to what we're eating? What's the problem with that?
Yeah, and I suppose in some ways we do adjust to our surroundings. So if you're taking an extremely disinterested high-level point of view, you could say it's not a positive or a negative, it just is how things are. But I think when it comes to teeth, there are specific problems it can lead to, the rise in orthodontic treatments, the kind of pain and expense, frankly, that can cause. The reason this is a story worth talking about is it's possibly just a more visible and eye-catching red flag about our diets in general, and it kind of just draws attention to something that we should probably be paying more attention to anyway.
Yeah, and to Chandrika, this example of children is eye-catching, but actually we're seeing the effects of soft food in adults as well.
Yeah, Holden mentioned orthodontics. There was a study from the British Orthodontic Society from the 10th of January this year, and over 70% of orthodontists report an increase in adults seeking orthodontic treatment within the past 3 years. So we're really looking at the invisible aligners that people are using, but there's definitely a lot of dissatisfaction with how adults are seeing their teeth. I think there's a few reasons why this dissatisfaction is creeping in. So online working and socialising and sort of video calls like the one we're on now can have an impact, and that's where 60% of orthodontists are saying people have come in and said that's a factor in seeking treatment.
Do you know how a video call can affect your teeth?
It's because you stare at yourself talking and you're like, oh God, that's what I look
so
like.
it makes yourself right, I see. Yes.
You're kind of looking into a mirror of just that, you realise that mirrors what other people are seeing of you as well.
Yeah.
And so it's really worrying. And the other one's really obvious. 38% of orthodontists say adult patients mention influencers and celebrities, again, on a phone, on a screen, and we are projecting ourselves onto them saying, why don't I look like them? And so we've already got that problem now that people are increasingly going to orthodontists.
Well, and there's a nice thread actually of kind of influencers and online culture going through all three stories that we're going to talk about on today's show, as you'll see. But Julia, as in the last story, it's a double-edged thing, isn't it? Because, yes, the examples that Chandrika just gave there are of technology making things worse for us physically, but actually it's the likes of TikTok and Instagram that have allowed people to understand the big industry in ultra-processed food for the first time in 50 years and question it more.
Yeah, these apps are information apps. But I think what's actually really important about this story and why Holden is very right to bring it up is I think we do have issues with how we feed and how we take care of young children, and a dearth of information about what to feed young kids is a huge problem. We maybe should be feeding our kids carrots when they're teething, but it's going to be hard for a parent to watch their kid bleeding with their gums and, doing things that they should do. Much easier to buy food that's easy, food that has been tailored to make them happy and to, be quick to prepare. right now, parents have a lot of pressures on their time. Parents are increasingly working. There is not enough information about how we should be cooking and feeding for our children. Childcare is becoming prohibitively expensive. Cost of everything is going up. It's much cheaper to buy fast food than to buy fresh ingredients and cook something from scratch, which also demands more time, which is a luxury that a lot of working parents do not have. And it's almost like, modern life is setting us up to fail in every way. And that right there, that feeling right there, that is why people in their desperation are turning to alternative methods and therefore vulnerable to misinformation, which is another, common thread running through these topics. It was interesting when I was reading around this story, hearing about the industrial diet. And that is basically the long-term transformation of food from a natural resource into an edible commodity that far too often fails to nourish us. Essentially something that is there to create profits. It's also referred to as the American diet. And, all these problems with kids, orthodontistry and dentistry, sugar is also going to be a huge part of that. And the influence of the huge American food industry has been hugely influential in shaping that.
But I guess, knowledge is power, as we're saying. And if you know that something's ultra-processed and that it's bad for you, but that's a managed risk, it's kind of okay, isn't it? I mean, I'm an addict of Pepsi Max, for example. I have probably one every day or every other day. I know that it has no nutritional value for me. I know it's a caffeine shot and corn syrup, but I like the taste of it. And I have it for the adrenaline, not for the satisfaction of actually consuming food. And I feel like that's okay because then I might have some cucumber.
But it is marketing. And, as I just mentioned, the huge food industry, which is really, particularly in America, set up to make profits rather than considering public health. Their bottom goal is selling things, marketing things, telling you want something that tastes good.
But it's not marketing because an apple doesn't do the same thing. Like there isn't an alternative. If there was a fruit that gave me the same buzz as the Pepsi Max, I would have that.
Well, I do think there is, particularly with sugar, there is conditioning. The more sugar you have, it does change your tastes. Same with salt. The more salt you get used to putting on your food, the saltier you want it. And that I know is true because my father, after he had heart surgery, he was advised to use less salt on his food. And he used to pour so much salt on his food. It was disgusting the amount of salt he used to sprinkle on his plate. And when he was told he couldn't have it, now he feels he doesn't need it. His tastes have acclimatized. And so I do also think that is a part of it, and some good news that you can train yourself into eating healthier.
Holden.
Yeah, I think that, this sort of story and anything around diet always raises the prospect of a sort of nanny state or a kind of patrician point of view of people being told that they can't have things they like. And I certainly think that, the habit plays a huge part in what people eat and what people like. And so I think, being aware of how it's literally changing the shape of our bodies does give people more information that they can then make a choice with. But I think it is, another common line from our earlier story is that it is also quite hard to establish cause and effect precisely in these sorts of studies. It's also the sort of information that you don't want to react to in an absolutist way. If you really enjoy a particular piece of ultra-processed food and that brings you joy, then I think denying yourself, that's a decision you have to make, and it's not necessarily going to improve your life all that much.
I mean, does this drip of stories, Chandrika, encourage you to abandon more ultra-processed foods? Just bit by bit, you might start to change your habits rather than abandoning things completely.
I think as an adult, you kind of know what is good for you, don't you? You know that a whole bag of Reese's Pieces is probably not better than an apple.
Just to pick a random example, I'm sure you've never done that.
What is it with the peanut butter and the chocolate is so good. And it's American, what a shock. But I did come across this other story, which I feel it's got a similar issue around messaging, around caring for children. And I wonder where the disconnect comes from. Also from this week, parents in Welsh County told to come into school to change nappies if their child is not toilet trained. Now, this story around children starting school and not being toilet trained, that comes up every couple of years.
It's phone in staple. I've done it myself.
That is something that happens, but now the school's sort of fighting back and saying, right, unless there's a medical need for the child, you are coming in to change the child. Where does this lack of knowledge come from? And there's some statistics in this piece from The Guardian, and it says like 50% of parents agree that everyone should know their child should be toilet trained before going to school. So 50% of parents they surveyed didn't know that. And so what is going wrong here? Is it that society is so atomized? Like it's impossible to buy a house next door to your parents for help if they do want to help care for their children. How are these really important bits of knowledge around very small children? How are they not getting passed on? Like the idea of your child going away for the whole day, they definitely have to use a toilet and they have to know how to do it themselves.
Okay, but this is a public health issue, Holden. This isn't just about etiquette, is it? This is people's jaws are changing. Children should be eating less soft food. Should the government be involved in at least getting some messaging out there along the lines that Chandrika is suggesting?
I think it is a difficult area for the government to involve itself in, because there are cost implications of feeding your children well. What we eat is wrapped up in social class. There's a risk of creating a backlash. You remember the parents of children turning up with turkey Twizzlers when Jamie Oliver tried to do something about school meals. So, yes, I think the government probably should be doing something, because this is something that will make a difference to life opportunities for a generation of children. But I don't envy them having to work out how to do that in a way that's actually going to be helpful.
Look, without offering a policy, a government can't just wade in, because it does feel very classist.
Home economics in schools.
Oh, I
Why
did that.
do we stop teaching home economics in schools? I think as a policy, that's a good place to start.
But your teeth are already screwed by the time you get to school. So it would be educating the next generation of parents when they have kids. Would that be the idea?
Better late than never. Better late than never. I'll also say I don't need to eat anything crunchy because I'm so stressed. I tend to grind my teeth in my sleep. So the mastication that goes on in my jaw is just fine.
Okay. Up next, TikTok. TikTok. Is it time to find another social network? That's after this. So Chandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has the clock run out on TikTok?
Ni hao, it's your Chinese spy. I hope you have enjoyed the content I have hand-selected for you over the years, but in case we don't get to see each other on here again, here are some tips and tricks to using RedNote. First thing to keep in mind is that this flood of Westerners is not something the app is designed to handle. You need to verify your phone number with them before you can do anything except just scroll. And it might take you a few tries to get a verification code, but it will come, just keep trying. There's no need to do weird stuff like, oh, let me turn off my Wi-Fi, or like, go into like this setting, this specific setting. No, just keep trying. Just keep hitting that button.
TikToker Jiran Zhao sharing tips on Wednesday on how to join, what was it, Chandrika?
It's known as RedNote, or here we go, Shanghongshu, which is now...
I'll stick with RedNote for the duration, but thank you for taking one for the team there.
I've tried. So this is the app that's hit number 1 on Apple's US App Store, because TikTok might get banned.
So it's a Chinese-owned social media video app, just like TikTok, and it's now number 1 in the United States.
That's true, yes. Yep. So this is happening because there's an ongoing process in the US at the moment that might see TikTok banned. Obviously, it's a gigantic app. It's the livelihood for many influencers. It's a really big deal. And the people on the app in the US are worried it'll get banned. So they're looking elsewhere, particularly to RedNote, to move next.
Okay, so give us the 101. You don't have to do it in a TikTok style. You can draw for breath. But what is RedNote and how is it different to TikTok?
So just for the listener, I am dancing right now.
Feel free to remix this.
So it's a short form video social media site. Some say it's a bit more like Pinterest, so you can sort of pin lists as well. But it does have a video element, so it's like TikTok in that sense. As sort of duplicates of TikTok, like YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels have shown us, it is difficult to replicate the TikTok experience. It's not exactly the same, but it is very, very popular, and it's where people are taking sort of TikTok trends, like the one we heard just earlier, your Chinese spy on the app, which is possibly TikTok's
I didn't know if
trend.
we should get into this, but that woman we were just playing, she was dressed in a sort of parody of a communist outfit, right? So that's a trend in itself.
So this might be the last big US trend on TikTok. Basically, they are responding, US TikTokers, to the potential ban, which we'll know about on the 19th of January, whether it's happened, by saying goodbye to their personal Chinese spy. Now, this is a joke about ByteDance, which owns TikTok, sort of
hilarious,
selling US data to the Chinese government. And I think this is part of why it's being banned, right? So they're having a joke at sort of the macro level as well. I think it's pretty smart. But yeah, there are lots of jokes about the death of TikTok on TikTok, which is part of our beautiful era.
Julia, are you concerned about TikTok? Is it any different to other social media companies, the ones that are owned by Brits and Americans?
Well, A lot of people, a lot of security experts are very, very concerned about data sharing apps and who has access to that data. And any Chinese company, any private Chinese company has to fall within the remit of Chinese law, which means that if they are asked by the Chinese government to surrender any data that they hold, they are obligated by law to do so. So obviously this is a big concern of a lot of lawmakers and cybersecurity experts, national security experts. However, TikTok is not the only app that does this. Shein and Temu, which are Chinese fast fashion apps, in a way, they can hoard a lot more of your own personal data than TikTok does.
Yeah, because they've got your credit card and they know what
They've
you buy.
got your credit card, your address, all this kind of stuff. They know your shopping habits. And also, back over in sunny old America, you have companies like Meta, which have admitted to selling their data to China, including firms like Huawei. Remember that company that we were also concerned about our national security. It's not that TikTok is the only app that there are data concerns and the fact that, there may or may not be access to the Chinese Communist Party on our personal private data. But I think it's really interesting because this trend that Sachandrika is talking about it reflects a lot of anger of TikTok users. Now, remember,
because they're sticking it to the man, aren't they? They're not. They could go on Threads or they could go on YouTube Shorts, but they're choosing a Chinese rival to say, "Up yours, I still want to stick with China."
Exactly. There is a lot of anger at Mark Zuckerberg for a whole lot of other things. Recently, he's announced that he's scrapping his content moderation, moving it from California to Texas. He went on Joe Rogan and started talking about how business needs to be more masculine and how he likes to beat up his friends, his guy friends from time to time, all that kind of stuff. So Zuckerberg is not winning many friends for his products. But I think the anger of a lot of TikTok users, don't forget that during COVID, a lot of people turned to social media to make money remotely. A lot of these big influencers who have big audiences on TikTok, they gain revenue from TikTok and they are looking at their livelihoods should this ban go ahead, and they are angry. And I have increasingly seen a lot of social media influencers who are not political, who are not involved in geopolitics, don't know anything about that. One in particular is an influencer I follow who is a skincare expert. And she uploaded this huge rant about all of this. And she said, what do you mean that our Congress is going to ban this app that, by the way, is headquartered in LA? You mean Congress cannot agree on banning guns, but you're going to ban an app? You can't agree on stopping Meta from selling our data to foreign entities. You're not going to stop predatory practices from insurance companies. You're not going to cancel student debt. She made the argument also that when she was in Egypt, she couldn't see certain news organizations and certain apps were blocked. And she said, what is happening really is that the American government, Congress, is not happy about TikTok as an information sharing app and that it's not about data. And she said that banning these kinds of apps is something that fascist governments do.
Okay, we keep using the word ban, Holden, but actually the language that I've heard coming out of the US, correct me if I'm wrong, is about selling it to a US company, creating a new version of US TikTok that ultimately will be owned by basically Microsoft. That's the idea, isn't it? So that's not really a ban.
It's a ban that can be avoided if the US operation is sold. And then you slightly need to clarify what ban means as well. It's not necessarily the case that it will simply stop. What the law states, and this was actually passed by Congress, and it's one of the few bits of bipartisan legislation that went through, and then Joe Biden signed it into law. But what it says is that app stores will no longer be able to carry the app, and US web server providers will no longer be able to kind of serve the data. So there is actually some doubt about exactly what would happen. A lot of experts say that ByteDance would be able to get around this if they diverted US traffic to servers that aren't in the US, but they won't be able to.
Making it even less secure.
Yeah,
for US users.
There's sort of at least 7 layers of irony in all of this legislation, not least the fact of American influencers complaining about censorship and then hot-footing over to a Chinese platform in its place. But yeah, if the US operations were sold to an American-owned company, that would completely get around the need for any other changes.
And also, Suchandrika, if this does become law and TikTok is banned in inverted commas, whatever that means, wouldn't that apply to RedNote too anyway? It would suffer from the same issues in regulatory terms, wouldn't it?
I think you would be looking at probably a blanket situation, because otherwise you'll get these apps popping up all the time and you'll just run into the same problems. So this does feel like more of like a trend on TikTok to stick it to the man.
It's protest.
Yeah, and like downloading it now is fine, but will people use it is another question, because there are other competitors out there. We've mentioned some of them, like there's Instagram, there's YouTube, there's Snapchat, there's Twitch, but also there's some lesser known ones which you might like to try. I'm not affiliated with any of them, nor sponsored by them. You have Lemon 8. It's a lemon with an 8 at the end, which is owned by TikTok's parent company ByteDance. That might go, actually. Clapper, a TikTok clone made up by a Dallas-based entrepreneur. So that could live. Triller music videos, and Zigazoo, which is made for kids. So we could give those a go. But it's a bit like when people leave Facebook, they kind of like end up between LinkedIn and Instagram and all these different places.
This is the problem, isn't it, Julia? You can leave for ethical reasons as well as an individual, and we've seen this a lot with Twitter, now X. A lot of people that I follow say, right, that's it, I'm off. They don't, by the way, deactivate their accounts because they're obviously thinking in the back of their minds, well, I might come back, or I don't want to lose those followers, but they stop posting. And then they go over to Blue Sky. I've done that too. hollyman.bsky.social or whatever it is, if you want to follow me there. But what happens is you can't actually replicate the experience that you used to have on Twitter, because it's the algorithm's different, the volume of traffic is different, and that surely is the same with TikTok. Like, whatever happens, people can't exactly replicate what they used to get from TikTok, because it is its own product. It is its own product, and I think one of the biggest actually differences between TikTok and I think Instagram and its Reels, which is probably for most Western audiences the closest app, is that TikTok does feel a lot more global than Instagram, which feels very, very American. And I do want to bring into this that a lot of the talk in Congress about TikTok hasn't just been about China and data sharing. It's also been about the coverage of the Israel-Gaza war. And there was actually a lull in the legislative process for banning TikTok after Joe Biden signed an executive order in 2021, which revoked Trump's ban on TikTok. And it all started up again after the October 2023 Hamas terrorist attacks in Israel. And what happened was the surge of TikTok videos from people in Gaza, from people putting forward a narrative that was sort of antithetical to the American version of events that you tend to see in Israel. American news organizations are very, very pro-Israel historically. I used to work for an American news organization. I know there were lots of testy arguments in the newsroom about things like reporting deaths in Gaza just because they were facilitated by Hamas-run hospitals and things. There is a big difference in coverage. And so for the first time, American, particularly young users, were seeing a whole different angle to this long-running, protracted conflict that they just did not get from their traditional news. Yes, and but the issue is, totally see your point on let's get an international perspective. The issue is, what TikTok does is it can, for the reasons you outlined earlier, give you just the Chinese perspective, right? It's not a question of what they're including so much as what they're excluding. The issue is you see what they show you, and in the same way that you're describing the problem of American viewers thinking this is the news, you see the news as is presented from the sources TikTok wants to show you, and it's not in the Chinese government's interest to show you things like the BBC or NBC. Well, that's certainly what congressmen and women have been saying, and alongside, what I'm sure are 100% genuine citizen journalists and users live streaming and showing footage of what's happening in Gaza. Alongside that, there's also a huge amount of misinformation and, quite disturbingly, a huge amount of anti-Semitic material also propagating on TikTok. And that was something that was a huge source of contention. And that is something that really exploded in the American political landscape and tied into the movement towards banning TikTok. There were many studies
studies that came out in the last year on the proliferation of anti-Semitism on TikTok. There was this one study which claimed that spending 30 minutes a day on TikTok increased the chances a respondent would hold anti-Semitic or anti-Israel views by 17%. And while that study was quite dubious, that was then repeated on live television in the primaries by Nikki Haley, like it was true. And so this is an important part of the debate that I think ought to be mentioned. It's not just about China, it's not just about data sharing, because we know Meta and other companies are doing the same, but TikTok is what American lawmakers feel is fast becoming the number one source of news for the younger demographics, and it's a source of news they cannot control and they cannot censor.
I do think that is a big part of it, and it's not just that it's a source of news that they can't control and can't censor, because that arguably applies to the BBC
YouTube.
or Facebook or YouTube, all sorts of things. It's more that it's a source of news that Western governments suspect that China could control and censor, the Chinese government could, even if it isn't necessarily doing so at the moment.
Well, even just through exclusion, as I was saying, this algorithm that's so secret that we don't know about, it could just literally be a case of not showing you things.
And so powerful as well. Like, I think that the real differentiator with TikTok, for good and bad, is that the algorithm is incredibly effective at working out what catches your attention and feeding more of that to you. There have been various studies trying to establish whether ByteDance and potentially by extension, agents of the Chinese government are able to influence or have influenced that algorithm. And this is yet another case where cause and effect are hard to link. And it's also possible that the algorithm can have a political effect that may be unintended. But what is certainly clear is that if either ByteDance or the Chinese government decided to use that algorithm to push a particular point of view, they certainly could. And I think you'd have to be quite naive to think that, if China decided it was going to invade Taiwan, I think you would only see one side of the argument, or at least you'd see one side of the argument get far more coverage.
Okay, so Chandrika, finally, this is your story. You've chosen it as your story of the week. Are you going to follow your own lead and decamp to RedNote?
I think I'm going to have a look at it and see, something that's hit number one in the charts. It might not be in a month, but seeing what people are looking at. So I'll give it a go. Should I be telling people? If you're going to start posting
videos, are you going to dress as a Chinese spy? And if not, what would your first video be? What would you tell people about yourself?
Do you know what? I'm going to have to get my lawyers to get back to you on this. I'm not sure it's safe.
I'll leak the photos I have of you dressed as a Chinese spy. Thanks to Suchandrika and Holden and Julia. That's it from us. You can follow the show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow now. You can also, by the way, get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.